in the blistering heart of the American Wild West, where truth often dies with the men who carry it, one legend refuses to stay buried. His name echoes through time like a shot fired in the dead of night. Billy the Kid. Officially, he died on July 14th, 1881, gunned down by the man sworn to bring him to justice, Sheriff Pat Garrett. The story goes that Garrett lay in wait, hidden in the darkness of Pete Maxwell's home. Billy walked in, unaware. He asked in Spanish, "Quién es?" "Who's there?" Garrett raised his revolver and pulled the trigger. One shot. The outlaw was dead. Case closed. But what if everything we think we know about that night is a lie? This story, repeated for over a century, has cracks, gaping holes that no amount of legend can cover. Let's start with the witnesses. There were only two, Pat Garrett and Pete Maxwell, and Maxwell never gave a full public account. He didn't testify. He didn't write a letter. He simply vanished from the narrative. Garrett told the tale, wrote the book, and made sure the world heard his version first. Convenient, isn't it? A single shooter, a dark room, no other eyes to verify what really happened. And here's the kicker. No one outside that room ever saw the body before it was buried. That's right. There was no official photograph, no coroner's report, and no verified witnesses who confirmed the corpse was actually Billy the Kid. Some locals said it didn't even look like him. And Garrett? He was quick to bury the body in Fort Sumner the very next day, sealing the legend before the dust had even settled. If you were truly killing the most wanted man in the West, wouldn't you want the world to see it? Wouldn't you need proof? Yet Garrett provided none. Let's talk motive. At the time, Pat Garrett was a freshly elected sheriff, under pressure to catch the West's most infamous fugitive. Bringing in Billy, dead or alive, would boost his career. But if Billy escaped again, Garrett's reputation would collapse. What's easier, admitting you failed, or claiming victory over a corpse no one could confirm? If you're starting to think this sounds less like justice and more like a cover-up, you're not alone. But it gets stranger. Garrett's story changed over time. In early versions, the events of that night were simple and direct. Later, the dialogue shifted. Timelines moved. Extra details were added that weren't there before, almost as if the tale was being rewritten. And it was. Garrett didn't write his own book. It was ghostwritten by a man who despised Billy the Kid and had every reason to paint him as a savage. But many who knew Billy described him differently. Charming, loyal, even likable. Not a cold-blooded killer, but a young man shaped by brutal circumstances. And let's not ignore Garrett's downfall. After claiming he killed Billy, Garrett didn't rise to fame and fortune. He fell. He struggled to win re-election. He failed in business. He was accused of corruption, got into land disputes, and was ultimately murdered in 1908, shot in the back by someone who may have wanted revenge, or maybe justice. The man who killed a legend died quietly and suspiciously, just like the outlaw he claimed to put in the ground. So ask yourself, what if Garrett didn't kill Billy the Kid? What if he shot another outlaw, someone nameless, someone who wouldn't be missed, and passed him off as Billy to secure his own legacy? It would explain the secrecy, the fast burial, the missing reports, and the conflicting details. It would explain why Billy's sightings continue for decades in Texas, in Mexico, in dusty towns where strangers spoke with familiar eyes. And it would explain why Garrett himself seemed haunted until the day he died. In the end, all we're left with is a question, one that haunted historians, authors, and conspiracy theorists for more than 140 years. Was Billy the Kid really killed that night, or did he vanish into legend? Because if Garrett lied, then Billy may have escaped, survived, and lived out his days under a different name. And if that's true, then history got it wrong. Very wrong. Coming up next, we'll explore the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid himself, Brushy Bill Roberts, an old gunslinger who stepped out of the shadows to demand the one thing the law never gave him, a second chance. Let's turn the spotlight to the man at the center of this mystery, Pat Garrett, the lawman, the hunter, the so-called hero. He's the one who told the world he killed Billy the Kid. But when we put his story under a microscope, things start to unravel. It's not just that his version of events is thin. It's that it shifts, bends, and breaks under the weight of its own contradictions. So let's ask the real question. Was Pat Garrett telling the truth or protecting a secret? In the beginning, Garrett's version of Billy's death seemed straightforward. He waited in Pete Maxwell's room. Billy entered, asked who's there, and Garrett fired. End of story. But here's the twist. Garrett's early accounts didn't match his later ones. The more time passed, the more details were remembered. Dialogue suddenly appeared. Descriptions got more cinematic. And this wouldn't be a problem if there were anyone to confirm them. But there wasn't. Only Garrett and Maxwell were there, and Maxwell barely spoke about it, even years later. Doesn't that seem odd? Garrett's book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, became the cornerstone of the official story. But here's what most people don't know. It was ghostwritten by a man named Ash Upson. And Upson didn't just dislike Billy. He wanted to destroy the legend. He crafted a narrative that painted Billy as a ruthless killer, a menace to society. Yet those who actually knew Billy described him very differently. Locals said he was polite, witty, even generous. He defended his friends, protected the weak, and was often more honorable than the men chasing him. So, which Billy do we believe? The one from the pages of Garrett's book, or the one remembered by people who rode beside him? And what about Garrett himself? History likes to cast him as the clean-cut sheriff who brought order to chaos. But dig deeper, and a darker picture emerges. Garrett struggled after the so-called shooting. He was not hailed as a hero. In fact, he faced harsh criticism, lost political support, and failed to get reelected. He clashed with ranchers, got involved in shady business deals, and was accused of using his badge for personal gain. His reputation soured quickly. Then in 1908, he was found murdered, shot in the back on a lonely road. Officially, it was over a land dispute. Unofficially, some say karma caught up. Others say someone he wronged finally got revenge. Now, think about this. If Garrett had faked Billy's death, if he had let the outlaw escape, maybe even help him disappear, would that explain his paranoia, his downfall, and the way he avoided public attention for the rest of his life? A man who just killed the most, wanted criminal in the West, should have become a legend. Instead, Garrett lived like a man haunted, not celebrated, but condemned by whispers and doubt. And here's where things get even more suspicious. Garrett never allowed anyone to photograph the body. In an era when photography was used to document outlaws, this stands out like a bullet hole in the truth. No wanted posters marked "Captured Dead." No press photo of the fallen kid. No proof, just Garrett's word. Would a sheriff proud of his victory hide the body? Or was he hiding the fact that he had the wrong man? Historians have debated this for decades. Some say Garrett did what he had to do. Others believe he staged the entire scene. Maybe he killed a different outlaw, one who looked like Billy, and passed him off to close the case. Maybe Billy knew too much. Maybe a deal was struck, vanish, and we both get to walk away. Is it really so far-fetched? Look around the time. The West was full of corruption, double crosses, and backroom deals. Lawmen weren't always clean, and outlaws weren't always dirty. Sometimes they were the same man in different hats. Garrett had everything to gain from Billy's death. But history suggests he may have lost more than he ever expected. His career collapsed. His story was doubted. And in the end, he died alone, shot down like the outlaws he once hunted. So we're left with a question that won't go away. Did Garrett kill Billy the Kid, or just a myth? Because if Billy survived, Garrett didn't just lie. He rewrote history. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. A man who, decades later, claimed to be Billy himself. An old man with scars, stories, and secrets that no one could explain away. Coming up next, the incredible tale of Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who said, "I am Billy the Kid, and I want my name cleared." Imagine this. Nearly 70 years after the supposed death of Billy the Kid, an old man walks into a lawyer's office in Texas and says, "I need a pardon because I'm Billy the Kid." At first, people laughed. But the more this man talked, the harder it became to ignore him. His name was Brushy Bill Roberts, and he wasn't just telling wild stories. He was naming names, describing shootouts, and revealing scars that matched the outlaw's troubled past. Could it be that the most famous gunslinger of the Wild West didn't die in 1881, but lived in secret for decades? Brushy Bill was no ordinary storyteller. When he spoke, he didn't hesitate. He recalled the Lincoln County War with chilling detail. He named people long forgotten, ranchers, deputies, accomplices. He described Billy's jailbreak, his near misses with lawmen, and the men who helped him vanish. These weren't vague memories. These were things only someone close to Billy the Kid, or Billy himself, could know. His stories matched historical records that weren't even public at the time. How could an old man from Texas know this unless he lived it? But Brushy Bill wasn't just seeking attention. He had a mission. He wanted something Billy had never received, a full pardon. Decades earlier, New Mexico's Governor Lew Wallace had promised Billy clemency in exchange for testimony. Billy gave the testimony. The pardon never came. Now, in 1950, an aging Brushy Bill, with failing health and a fire still burning his eyes, wanted to finish what had begun 70 years earlier. He wanted justice. To help him, Brushy turned to William Morrison, a respected lawyer and investigator. Morrison had worked with hundreds of veterans on pension claims. He was no fool, but the more he interviewed Brushy, the more he believed him. Morrison gathered evidence, documents, witness interviews, comparisons, and brought them to the state of New Mexico. The media caught wind. Headlines exploded. Billy the Kid seeks pardon. The public was divided. Some were curious. Others were furious. But the governor agreed to meet the man claiming to be Billy face to face. That meeting was a disaster. Brushy Bill walked into the room under the weight of cameras, reporters, and flashing lights. He was nearly blind from a stroke, and the pressure was unbearable. The governor grilled him with hard questions. Brushy stumbled, forgot details, couldn't respond fast enough. He was humiliated. Days later, he died of a heart attack, never receiving the pardon he came for. Was it the stress that killed him, or the heartbreak of knowing he'd been dismissed one last time as a liar? Now let's look at the evidence. Brushy had scars, a bullet wound in the chest, another on his back, exactly where Billy was said to have been shot in past gunfights. He had intimate knowledge of court proceedings from the 1870s, names of deputies, and precise maps of places long changed by time. Photographic comparisons were made between Brushy and the famous tintype photo of Billy the Kid. Facial recognition experts were divided. Some said it was a match, others weren't convinced. But the resemblance was undeniable. Still, not everyone believed him. Detractors said he was just an old cowboy with a good memory and a thirst for attention. They pointed to inconsistencies, shaky recollections, and the fact that at 90 years old, Brushy's mind wasn't as sharp as it once had been. But ask yourself this. How many elderly men can recount courtroom testimony from 70 years ago, word for word? And here's something wild. Brushy didn't just tell stories. He was known in his hometown of Hyco, Texas, as a quiet man who hinted at a deeper past. Locals claimed he made strange remarks, muttered about shooting the sheriff, and carried himself like someone who'd lived 100 lives. When asked directly, he would sometimes pause, then simply say, "It's all behind me now." So what if he was telling the truth? What if Billy the Kid had escaped the chaos of New Mexico, assumed a new name, and lived quietly for decades, waiting for the moment to set the record straight? It would mean the history books got it wrong, that the sheriff who became a legend built his story on a lie, and that the most famous outlaw in American history didn't die young, but lived long enough to beg for redemption. Coming up next, the grave mystery. Where is Billy really buried, and why can't we dig up the truth? Stick around as we head into one of the West's greatest unsolved puzzles. In the dusty fields of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, there's a grave that draws tourists from around the world. The headstone reads Billy the Kid, flanked by the names of his fallen companions, Tom Folliard and Charlie Baudry. People leave flowers, coins, even handwritten letters. But here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. We're not even sure Billy the Kid is buried there. No one saw the body clearly. No photos were taken. And more than a century later, the location of his final resting place is still one of the West's greatest unsolved mysteries. Let's rewind. On July 15th, 1881, the day after Pat Garrett claimed to have shot Billy, a quick burial was arranged. There was no public viewing, no official photograph of the corpse, just a few close associates and Garrett himself overseeing the process. The kid was supposedly buried near his friends, men who had fought and died beside him. A wooden cross marked the spot. But over time, even that faded away. And that's where the mystery deepens. In 1904, a massive flood swept through Fort Sumner's old cemetery. Water tore through the earth, shifting soil, moving graves, washing away markers. Think about that. Imagine a flood washing through a graveyard. Coffins moved. Bones were displaced. Markers were lost or destroyed. No one could say with certainty where each person now lay. And in the middle of it all was the unmarked grave of Billy the Kid. Without photos, without DNA, and without an exact location, how could we be sure he's even there? Later, a marble headstone was placed, etched with Billy the Kid, Pals. It was meant to honor not just Billy, but his companions too. But here's the problem. It was placed using best guesses, not confirmed coordinates. Locals pointed to where they thought the grave was. No records backed it up. And that stone? It's been stolen twice. Once in 1950, again in 1981. Both times it was recovered. But every theft added a layer of mystery. Who took it? Why? And what secrets were they trying to uncover or hide? Now fast forward to the 1990s. As rumors about Brushy Bill Roberts spread, curiosity about Billy's final resting place exploded. People began to ask, why not just test the body, dig up the remains, do DNA testing? And the debate seems simple, right? But then came the bombshell. No one could find the exact grave. After flood, the bodies could have shifted by feet or by yards. The headstone was symbolic. No one could say, yes, Billy is buried exactly here. The grave was quite literally lost to time. And it gets stranger. In 2003, Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and a former New Mexico judge petitioned to exhume the grave. Their goal? DNA testing to confirm the body's identity. But the state attorney general blocked the move. The reason? No legal basis, they said. No crime to solve. No direct descendant requesting it. And no way to ensure the remains were Billy's. In other words, it was a historical gamble they weren't willing to take. Others speculated there was another reason. What if testing proved the body wasn't Billy at all? Think about the implications. Fort Sumner thrives on a legend. The grave is a tourist hotspot. Museums, hotels, shops all make money off Billy's story. If a test proved the body wasn't his, that could wreck the entire town's identity. Some believe that's why testing was stopped. Not because it's impossible, but because the truth might be too inconvenient. And there's more. Some say Billy isn't in Fort Sumner at all. Others believe he was buried in Old Mexico or even Texas under a fake name. After all, if Garrett lied about the killing, then the whole burial was a cover, a performance to close the book on a wild chapter of Western history. And if Billy survived, then that grave is empty. So, what we really know, we know a flood destroyed the cemetery layout. We know the headstone was stolen multiple times. We know state officials refused to dig. And we know the location of Billy's body, if it exists, remains a complete mystery. If you were in charge, would you authorize the dig? Would you risk proving that history's most famous outlaw was never in that grave? Or would you let the legend rest in peace, even if the truth stayed buried? The story of Billy's grave isn't just about bones in the ground. It's about legacy, money, and what we choose to believe. Up next, why modern science still can't solve this. We'll break down the DNA dilemma and explore the legal and scientific roadblocks that keep this mystery sealed tight. Don't go anywhere, this story is just heating up. In an age where DNA has solved centuries-old murders and even identified ancient pharaohs, you'd think unlocking the truth behind Billy the Kid's death would be simple. Dig up the grave, extract the DNA, compare it with potential relatives or known remains, and confirm once and for all whether it was Billy who died in Fort Sumner in 1881. But here's the shocking truth. Despite all our modern technology, science still can't close the case. And it's not because we don't have the tools. It's because we don't have the body. Or worse, we might have the wrong one. Let's start with what happened in the early 2000s. Fueled by the rising fame of Brushy Bill Roberts and increasing public interest in solving the mystery, New Mexico officials faced growing pressure to act. Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and others proposed an exhumation of the grave in Fort Sumner. Their goal was to collect DNA samples from the remains buried under the stone marked Billy the Kid, Pals, and compare them to any known living relatives or even to Brushy Bill's remains in Hyco, Texas. But immediately, the plan ran into a wall of red tape and controversy. First, there's the biggest problem of all. No one can confirm the grave contains Billy's body. After the devastating flood of 1904, which washed away markers and possibly even unearthed coffins, the cemetery was left in total disarray. With markers gone and bodies shifted, grave locations became guesses, not certainties. Would you dig up a grave when you don't even know if the right person is under it? That's the first hurdle, and it's a massive one. Even if by some miracle they identified the correct bones, the next problem is chain of custody. In forensic science, chain of custody refers to the unbroken documentation showing how evidence was collected, stored, and protected from contamination. But here's the thing. Billy's supposed remains have been sitting in wet, unstable New Mexico soil for over a century. Add in the flood, exposure to the elements, vandalism, and zero documentation, and what do you get? A chain of custody so broken it may as well not exist. Any DNA pulled from those bones could be compromised, degraded, or mixed with others. Now, let's say you somehow found intact DNA from Fort Sumner. What would you compare it to? That brings us to the next issue, lack of verified living relatives. Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty, likely in New York, but he left little family trace. His mother, Catherine McCarty, died when he was young, and while he had a younger brother named Joseph, no. Confirmed biological descendants are known today. Without a clear, genetically verified relative, who would serve as a comparison sample? And what about Brushy Bill Roberts? He was buried in Hyco, Texas, and many supporters of his story have called for his remains to be exhumed too. The idea: compare his DNA to the bones at Fort Sumner. If they match, it proves he was Billy. If not, then maybe the legend ends. But there's a problem. Just like New Mexico, Texas has refused to exhume Brushy Bill. Their reasoning? Too much time has passed. No crime is involved, and the man is buried under his legal name. So now both potential sources of truth, Billy's grave and Brushy Bill's, are legally off limits. And even if both states agreed to dig, DNA science still faces a final hurdle: degradation. After more than 140 years, DNA can break down. In hot, dry, or wet environments like those in New Mexico and Texas, biological material deteriorates quickly. Bones become brittle. Genetic markers vanish. The odds of pulling usable DNA from either grave are slim, not impossible, but very low. And even if the test produced a result, skeptics would still question it. Why? Because any sample could be contaminated, mislabeled, or misinterpreted. So we're left with modern mystery that science can't solve. Not because it's too advanced, but because the historical foundation is too shaky. Missing records, unconfirmed graves, legal blocks, and the slow decay of time all combine to lock the truth behind layers of uncertainty. And let's not forget one more powerful reason the grave remains untouched: money. Fort Sumner thrives on Billy the Kid tourism. If an exhumation proved Billy isn't buried there, the town's legend, its identity, could collapse. For many, it's safer to let sleeping bones lie. So, could DNA testing finally solve the Billy the Kid legend? The answer is a complicated maybe. Technically, it's possible. Realistically, it's nearly impossible. The technology exists, but the access, clarity, and cooperation don't. Instead, the mystery remains intact, protected by legal battles, tourism interests, and the unstoppable decay of time. But this leads us to the final, most haunting question of all. What if Billy the Kid never died that night in 1881? What if Garrett lied? A body was buried under a false name, and the real Billy rode off into obscurity. Coming up next, we dive into men who claim to be him, and why some people believe Billy the Kid may have lived far longer than history will ever admit. In the decades following July 14th, 1881, the night Billy the Kid was supposedly gunned down by Pat Garrett, whispers of survival refuse to die. Across dusty towns and border settlements, in whispers at saloons and on front porches, men began to appear claiming they were him. Not just followers, not admirers. But the actual Billy the Kid, alive, older, and looking to finally tell the world the truth. And among all the imposters, one name rose above the rest: Brushy Bill Roberts. But he wasn't the only one. The legend had grown so large, so tangled in doubt and missing evidence, that the very myth of Billy surviving started to become more believable than the official version. Let's start with the lesser-known figures, men who wandered into towns across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, claiming to be the outlaw who dodged death. One such man was John Miller, who lived quietly in Arizona and often hinted that he was Billy the Kid. Locals said he shared details only Billy would know. He bore a striking resemblance. He even had matching scars. After his death in the 1930s, suspicions only deepened. His family never confirmed his identity, but many still believe he was more than just a cowboy with stories. Then came another, a drifter who appeared in Kansas in the 1920s under the name Ollie Billy Lunn. His story followed the same pattern. He had scars, old tales, and deep knowledge of the Lincoln County War. But his story, like the others, faded without proof. Now to the most compelling figure of them all, Brushy Bill Roberts. When Brushy came forward in 1949, he didn't ask for fame. He didn't want money. He wanted a pardon. He claimed the government had promised Billy the Kid clemency in exchange for testimony, but that promise was never honored. Now, at nearly 90 years old, he wanted the record set straight. His lawyer, William Morrison, investigated Brushy's story and was stunned. The man didn't just know a few facts. He knew everything. Details from court transcripts, lawmen's names, minor characters no one remembered, and accounts of shootouts that had never been published. He recounted what happened inside the McSween house during the Lincoln County War with surgical precision. Brushy Bill also had matching scars, one on his back, another on his chest, just like the wounds reported on Billy during his lifetime. He even walked with the same slight limp Billy was rumored to have had in his later days. But the case wasn't just built on stories and scars. Photographs were brought into the debate. When forensic analysts compared old tintypes of Billy, the Kid, with known images of Brushy Bill, facial structure, ear shape, and bone alignment all matched. Some experts were convinced. Others cried fraud, claiming age and grainy quality made comparisons unreliable. Still, the evidence was mounting. In 1950, Brushy Bill was brought to Santa Fe to meet with the governor of New Mexico. His request: an official pardon for crimes committed as Billy the Kid. But what should have been a quiet legal meeting turned into a media circus. The governor grilled him. Reporters flashed cameras. The old man stumbled under pressure. He forgot some facts. He misspoke. And within weeks, perhaps in the stress, Brushy Bill dropped dead from a heart attack. He was buried in Hamilton, Texas, under the name William H. Roberts. But locals still whisper that Billy the Kid rests there, not in Fort Sumner. So what do we make of all this? Were these just old men chasing attention? Were they mentally confused? Or was one of them truly the kid who got away? It's hard to say. But here's what we do know. Every one of these men appeared decades before the internet, before easy access to archived records or books. And yet, they knew things that only someone close to Billy could have known. Details not found in dime novels. Names not even mentioned in Garrett's own book. These weren't just fans. They were insiders. And here's another haunting twist. Garrett never publicly addressed any of these claims. He never responded to rumors, never clarified inconsistencies in his story. Some historians believe he stayed silent because he knew the truth wasn't so simple. Maybe he killed someone else that night. Maybe he let Billy go. Or maybe Billy bribed his way out, and Garrett helped cover it up. There's even a theory that Garrett regretted his involvement and carried guilt until his own violent death years later. The existence of so many claimants, combined with missing documentation, a rushed burial, and a questionable motive, leaves the door wide open. Maybe the government wanted the story over. Maybe the people needed a legend. Or maybe, just maybe, Billy the Kid outlived the myth. Coming up next, we explore the most chilling chapter yet. If Garrett didn't kill Billy, then who is buried in that unmarked grave in Fort Sumner? And why has no one dared to dig up the truth? Stay tuned. If Billy the Kid truly died in 1881, there should be a grave A clear one, a place marked, honored, verified by law and history. But instead, what we have is a cemetery cloaked in confusion, a flood-damaged burial site, a missing coroner's report, and a tombstone that's been stolen more times than the truth itself. Over a century later, we still don't know, with any real certainty, who lies beneath the ground in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. And that's the mystery that keeps this legend alive. Let's start with what history claims. After Pat Garrett allegedly shot Billy the Kid on the night of July 14th, 1881, the outlaw's body was supposedly buried the next day at Fort Sumner Cemetery. He was laid to rest beside two of his closest friends, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Beaudry, men who had died in the same war that made Billy a legend. But there was a problem from the start. The grave was never properly marked. No stone, no official record, no confirmation. It was just dirt and whispers, surrounded by hearsay and half-truths. It stayed that way for decades. Then came 1904. A flood swept through the area, soaking the land, disrupting graves, and shifting remains. Wooden markers, already worn by time, were destroyed. Some bodies reportedly floated from their resting spots. Others were buried deeper in mud, their positions lost forever. Historians believe this single natural disaster erased what little certainty there was about Billy's burial. Years later, a marble headstone was installed bearing the names Billy the Kid, Pals, referencing the three men buried there. But even that was a guess. You might wonder, why not just dig? Why not verify it with science and settle the legend once and for all? Well, it's not that simple. For years, multiple efforts were made to conduct DNA testing. In the 1990s and again in the early 2000s, officials in New Mexico debated opening the grave to collect genetic samples. The idea was to compare remains from Fort Sumner with those of Billy's mother, Henry McCarty, believed to be buried in Silver City, New Mexico. A match could confirm once and for all if the man in the grave really was her son. But the state refused. Why? On the surface, they cited legal obstacles. There was no active criminal case, no family requesting the test, and no confirmed location of the remains due to the flood damage. But beneath that, some believe there were economic motives. Fort Sumner's claim to fame, its draw for tourists and historians, rests entirely on belief that Billy the Kid is buried there. If a test disproved that, it could hurt tourism revenue, rewrite history books, and collapse a century-old narrative. The issue wasn't just DNA. It was a lack of chain of custody. In forensic science, every piece of evidence must be verifiable. But the grave in Fort Sumner has been disturbed, flooded, and possibly relocated. The body, if it's even still intact, has been underground for well over 140 years. Contamination, movement, and decay make any test result suspect. Add to that the political firestorm of digging up a national icon's grave, and you start to understand why no shovel has touched that dirt in decades. But Fort Sumner isn't the only grave in this mystery. Down in Hamilton, Texas, another headstone rests under the name Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid in 1950. Some have called for his body to be exhumed instead, arguing that comparing Brushy's DNA with Henry McCarty's would offer the clearest answer. But even that has hit legal roadblocks. Families involved must approve. States must agree. And some simply don't want to know. Ask yourself this. What if they did the tests, and it turned out the man buried in Fort Sumner wasn't Billy? What if Brushy Bill's DNA matched Henry McCarty's instead? The history books would burn. Pat Garrett's legend would collapse. Fort Sumner would lose its most famous story. Maybe that's why the grave remains untouched, not out of reverence, but out of fear. At the heart of this mystery isn't just a missing body. It's a larger question. Do we want the truth or do we need the legend? The grave at Fort Sumner doesn't just hold bones. It holds the weight of over a century of American folklore. It's a tomb built from myths, money, and memory. And until someone is brave enough or foolish enough to dig it all up, the kid's story will stay exactly where it is, buried, just beneath the surface. Coming up next, we go even deeper. Why DNA may never be enough to solve this legend, and what the final chapter of Billy the Kid's story might truly look like. In an age where DNA can solve centuries-old crimes, identify royal remains, and reunite families across oceans, you'd think it would be easy to prove whether Billy the Kid is buried in Fort Sumner. But here's the twist. Despite all our modern breakthroughs, when it comes to the West's most legendary outlaw, science has hit a wall. A hard one. DNA can't save the story. At least, not yet. It all sounds simple, right? Dig up the grave in Fort Sumner. Extract the DNA. Compare it to the remains of Billy's mother, Henry McCarty. And boom! Case closed. But the devil is in the details. And in this case, the details are disaster. For one, we're not even sure where Billy's body actually is. After the 1904 flood that swept through Fort Sumner Cemetery, grave markers were lost, bones were shifted, and the original burial spot was left completely untraceable. Some say he lies under the headstone. Others think he's a few feet away. A few believe he was never buried there at all. But even if, and if they could locate the right set of bones, there's another problem: contamination. These remains have been in the ground for over 140 years, exposed to moisture, bacteria, and human interference. Bones degrade. DNA breaks down. Add to that the lack of proper forensic control. No sealed containers, no preservation. And any test could easily return inconclusive or misleading results. Then comes the legal labyrinth. In the early 2000s, Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and a former judge made a bold push to dig up the grave for testing. They believed that only science could settle this mystery once and for all. But the state of New Mexico shut them down. The Attorney General at the time said there was no legal precedent for disturbing a historical grave without a criminal investigation or family request. And since Billy has no confirmed descendants, there was no one to file such a petition. Now imagine you're a politician or a state official. Would you want to be the one who approved the digging up of a national legend? Especially if there's a risk it might prove that your entire state's tourism is built on a myth? That's what Fort Sumner officials feared. If the body isn't Billy's, the town loses its identity. If it is, and DNA doesn't match up with Brushy Bill or Henry McCarty, the debate only grows louder. No matter the outcome, someone loses. That's not a gamble many are willing to take. And yet, the idea refuses to die. Every few years, the debate is reignited. New technologies are proposed. New forensic teams offer solutions. Even private investigators have stepped in, offering to fund the exhumation and testing. But the legal wall holds. Unless the state changes its stance or a court orders it, Billy's bones stay buried. Let's not forget about Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid in the 1950s. He's buried in Hamilton, Texas. In theory, we could exhume his body and compare it to Billy's mother, assuming we can find her grave and that her remains are viable. But here again we run into issues. Brushy's family would have to consent. Catherine's grave would have to be opened. And even then, we'd be relying on degraded 19th century DNA to deliver a clear answer. In cases this old, certainty is a rare luxury. Here's something most people don't realize. Even if DNA results were possible, they might not end the debate. Why? Because legends don't die with proof. They live in the space between facts and faith. Some people will always believe Billy escaped. Others will insist he was gunned down in the dark. DNA won't change that. Just look at the stories surrounding Jesse James, D.B. Cooper, or Anastasia Romanoff. Proof doesn't erase passion. It just fuels it differently. So where does that leave us? In limbo. A place where science can't move forward and legends won't fade away. Where graves stay closed, questions stay open, and history remains locked behind caution tape and legal red tape. The Wild West was a place where truth and myth were often the same thing, riding side by side through dust and fire. Maybe it still is. Up next, let's rewind to the beginning. Who was Billy the Kid really? Before the ghost stories and gunfights, before the legends and lies, what kind of person was Henry McCarty? Stick around. Because to understand how this myth began, we first have to understand the boy behind the bullets. Before the myths, before the manhunt, before the legends that would stretch across centuries, there was just a boy. His name was Henry McCarty. Not Billy the Kid. Not William H. Bonney. Just Henry. A skinny, fatherless teenager tossed into the unforgiving frontier of the American West. And what happened to that boy would shape one of the most iconic outlaw stories in history. So who was he really? What drove him to pick up a gun? To run from the law? and why, over 100 years later, are we still so fascinated by him. Henry was most likely born in 1859, though the exact date is debated, and his early life was marked by hardship. Born in New York City to Irish immigrants, his father disappeared early, and his mother, Catherine McCarty, struggled to provide for her two sons. Seeking opportunity, she moved west, first Indiana, then Kansas, and eventually to Silver City, New Mexico. But life didn't get easier. Catherine died of tuberculosis when Henry was just 14. Alone, broke, and orphaned in a violent world, he had no safety net, no mentor, no structure, only survival at first. He tried to get by. He worked odd jobs, swept floors, ran errands, but the world was cruel to orphans, and the system branded him early. At age 16, he was arrested for stealing clothes from a laundry line, a petty crime born of poverty. And just like that, the kid was born. He escaped jail, fled the town, and never stopped running. Have you ever made a small mistake and watched it snowball into something you couldn't control? That was Billy's life. One wrong move, one harsh label, and the path ahead turned to dust and gunfire. But here's the twist. Billy wasn't born a killer. His first known fatal shooting happened in 1877, at age 17, when he killed a blacksmith named Francis Cahill in Arizona. Cahill, by all accounts, was a drunken bully who had been harassing Billy for weeks. On the final day, he slammed Billy to the ground, laughing as he roughed him up. Billy pulled a gun and shot him in self-defense. Cahill died. Billy ran. The law didn't care about context. They saw blood and issued a warrant. From then on, Henry McCarty was a wanted man. He returned to New Mexico and joined a group of cattle rustlers, branding cattle, selling stolen livestock, skirting the edge of civilization. But it was during the Lincoln County War that Billy would truly become infamous. This was no mere outlaw feud. It was a corporate battle where two powerful business factions fought over money, land, and control of the New Mexico territory. On one side was the Dolan Murphy gang, backed by the local sheriff, political elites, and corrupt businessmen. On the other, a young rancher named John Tunstall, who hired Billy and promised him honest work. Tunstall treated Billy like a son, gave him a horse, a gun, a chance. When Tunstall was murdered by Dolan's men in cold blood, Billy snapped. He swore revenge. He joined the Regulators, a vigilante posse determined to bring Tunstall's killers to justice. It wasn't about money. It was about loyalty, about betrayal, about a boy trying to make things right the only way he knew how, with a six-shooter. The Regulators sparked a war. Ambushes, house raids, courthouse shootouts. Lincoln County became a war zone. Billy was in the center of it all. Smart, fast, fearless. He killed deputies, dodged posses, escaped from burning buildings and tight traps. Every time they thought they had him, he disappeared, and the legend grew. Newspapers turned him into a folk hero. Dime novels painted him as a smiling gunfighter, always one step ahead. To some, he was Robin Hood. To others, a devil in boots. But the truth was far more human. Billy was a teenager, barely in his 20s, living day to day in a world of violence, greed, and betrayal. He laughed. He danced. He spoke fluent Spanish. He wrote letters. He mourned his dead friends. And through it all, he ran. From the law, from his past, from the destiny others tried to force on him. By 1880, he was captured by former friend Pat Garrett, now sheriff, jailed in Lincoln, sentenced to hang. But Billy wouldn't go out in chains. In one of the most daring escapes in Western history, he killed 2 guards, grabbed a horse, and rode off into the sunset, smiling as he vanished. But his time was almost up. Just 3 months later, on July 14, 1881, Garrett claimed he shot Billy in the dark at Fort Sumner. No trial, no last words, just a gunshot in the night. And from that moment on, Billy the Kid became more legend than man. Books, films, songs, they all told different versions. But few truly captured the boy behind the bullets. I end the next chapter. We'll return to that final night, to the dimly lit room, to Garrett's changing story. Because if you thought this tale was over, it's not. The legend of Billy the Kid is just getting started now that you've met the real Billy, the orphan boy who outran death time and again. Let's return to the night of July 14th, 1881. Pat Garrett claimed that this was the moment it all ended. That Billy the Kid walked into a dark bedroom at Fort Sumner and was shot down instantly. No fight, no warning, just a whisper in Spanish, "¿Quién es?" and a gunshot. But if that version sounds too neat, too cinematic, that's because it probably is. Let's take a closer look at what Pat Garrett actually said, and why so many people, then and now, simply don't believe him. According to Garrett, he was hiding in the dark bedroom of Pete Maxwell's house. He and his deputies had heard rumors Billy was nearby. Garrett says Billy entered, unaware that Garrett was waiting. When Billy saw a shadow, he asked, "Who's there?" Garrett raised his revolver and fired. The bullet struck the figure in the chest. Billy fell to the floor, dead. Case closed, or was it? Here's where things get complicated. Garrett's version is the only detailed account we have, and it has more holes than a saloon door after a shootout. First, there were no official witnesses. Pete Maxwell was supposedly in the room, but never gave a clear statement. He didn't confirm Garrett's version publicly. In fact, no one else saw the killing happen. That's the first red flag. The second, Garrett never allowed the body to be viewed publicly. There were no photos taken, and the coroner's report vanished. That's not just sloppy, that's suspicious. Now, think about this. Billy the Kid was the most wanted outlaw in the West. If a sheriff killed him, wouldn't they parade the body through town? Prove it to the public? Take a photo for the press? Instead, Garrett had the body buried within 24 hours in a poorly marked grave. And he did all this in a town where many people admired Billy and hated Garrett. Why rush? Why hide? Even locals at the time raised their eyebrows. Some claimed the dead man didn't look like Billy. Others said Garrett had shot a ranch hand, or even one of Billy's companions, and passed him off as the outlaw. After all, Garrett had just been elected sheriff. His reputation rested on catching Billy. If Billy escaped again, Garrett would be humiliated. But if Billy was dead, Garrett was a hero, even if the truth was murky. And here's something most people don't know. Garrett's story changed over the years. In his first account, he told the tale simply. Later, in his published biography, the version grew more dramatic. He added lines of dialogue, more emotion, more suspense, almost like he was turning it into a Hollywood script before Hollywood even existed. Why change the story if it was true? And let's talk about that book, the one Garrett wrote. In reality, it was ghostwritten by Ash Upson, a man who hated Billy the Kid. Upson painted Billy as a cold-blooded killer with no heart and no soul. But dozens of people who knew Billy personally described him very differently. As smart, funny, loyal. The people of Fort Sumner, many of them Mexican-American, considered Billy a friend. He spoke their language, danced at their fiestas, and protected their communities. Garrett's version erased all of that. And what happened to Pat Garrett after his supposed victory? His life fell apart. He couldn't hold public office again. He lost money. He got into shady land deals. People called him a liar. And in 1908, Garrett was shot in the back, killed on a lonely road in New Mexico. Some say it was revenge. Others call it poetic justice. Either way, it marked the end of a man who may have traded the truth for glory. Have you ever told a lie so big you had to keep living it, even when it started eating away at you? Maybe that's what Garrett did. Maybe he shot someone else that night. Or maybe he shot the kid and regretted it for the rest of his life. What we do know is this. No one ever proved Billy died that night. And in the years that followed, something strange started happening. People claimed to see Billy in Texas, in Mexico, in California. And one of them didn't just claim to see him. He claimed to be him. His name was Brushy Bill Roberts, and his story would reignite the fire behind one of America's greatest mysteries. In the next chapter, we'll follow the trail of this mysterious old man who said, "I am Billy the Kid." Was he a fraud? Or the outlaw who cheated death and came back to clear his name? Get ready. The legend is about to get stranger than fiction. Votes nearly 70 years after Billy the Kid was allegedly gunned down in the dark, an old man walked into the spotlight with a claim so outrageous, it shook the foundation of Wild West history. His name was Brushy Bill Roberts, and he didn't whisper his story. He shouted it. "I am Billy the Kid," he said, not as a joke, not in passing, but as a final act in a life filled with secrets. And the strangest part? He had details, scars, and stories that made even skeptics stop and think. Could the West's most infamous outlaw have survived and lived in hiding for decades? Let's rewind in 1950. A lawyer named William Morrison was helping an old veteran apply for his pension. During their conversation, Morrison noticed something odd. The man, Brushy Bill, started talking about people from Lincoln County, about Billy's jailbreak, about Pat Garrett, Sheriff Brady, Doc Scurlock, and even the 5-day battle in Lincoln. At first, Morrison assumed it was just a history buff rambling. But then the old man described gunfights, hideouts, and personal conversations that were never printed in any book. Information that could have only come from someone who had been there. Brushy Bill claimed he'd been living under various aliases for decades. He said that in 1881, Garrett didn't shoot him, but someone else. He escaped New Mexico, fled to Texas, changed his name, and lived quietly, avoiding lawmen, journalists, and fame. He didn't want attention. What he wanted, all those years later, was simple. The pardon he was promised. You see, back in 1879, New Mexico's Governor Lew Wallace had offered Billy the Kid a deal, testify in court, and he'd get a full pardon. Billy did his part. He cooperated, but the pardon never came. Brushy Bill said that haunted him. And now, as an old man, he wanted justice. Not money, not fame, just a recognition that he was done wrong. When Morrison looked deeper, things got weird. Brushy Bill had bullet scars in the same spots Billy reportedly had. He knew details that weren't in any published record. He even remembered small-town names, old deputies, and the layout of buildings long since destroyed. Morrison, a lawyer trained to spot lies, became convinced. Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid. Together, they made a bold move. They petitioned the governor of New Mexico, Thomas Mabry, to grant the pardon Billy had been promised 70 years earlier. The media caught wind. Reporters swarmed. The meeting was set, and on November 30th, 1950, Brushy Bill stood before the governor to tell his truth. It did not go well. Imagine being 90 years old, your heart failing, surrounded by flashbulbs, reporters, skeptics, and a politician who didn't want to be seen as gullible. Brushy Bill stumbled under the pressure. He forgot dates. He misspoke names. The governor dismissed him, laughed him off. The press tore him apart. Just 3 weeks later, Brushy Bill suffered a heart attack and died. He never got his pardon, but he left behind a storm of questions that still rage today. So, was he telling the truth? Let's look at the evidence. First, there are the physical scars. Matching wounds to the chest, shoulder, and back, all places Billy was said to have been shot. Then there's the photo comparison. Facial recognition experts examined the famous tintype of Billy the Kid next to photos of Brushy Bill. Some said it was a match. Others disagreed. It became a national debate. And then there's the historical accuracy. Brushy Bill knew things only Billy or someone extremely close to him would have known. He talked about the way Pat Garrett moved his hand before drawing. He recalled a minor horse theft in Lincoln that only showed up in old arrest logs. These weren't public facts. These were first-hand memories. Critics argued he was just an old man chasing one last moment of fame, that he'd read dime novels, watched movies, and convinced himself of fantasy. But even today, many in Hyco, Texas, where Brushy Bill lived, believe he was a real deal. The town built a Billy the Kid museum in his honor. Visitors come from all over the world to see the documents, the photos, and make up their own minds if it was all an act. It was one of the most convincing performances in Old West history. And if it wasn't, then everything we thought we knew about Billy the Kid's death is a lie.so. Here's the question. If someone you believed to be long dead showed up 70 years later, with the scars, the memories, and the motive to prove who they were, would you believe them? Or would you do what the governor did, laugh and move on? In the final stretch of the story, we dig even deeper, into the grave that might not be Billy's, into the missing DNA, into the government's refusal to test. Because if we can't even be sure of who's buried at Fort Sumner, how can we say for certain who died that night in 1881? Up next, Billy's grave. The mystery of the missing bones. Imagine the most famous outlaw in American history being laid to rest, but no one knows where his body really is. That's the strange truth behind the mystery of Billy the Kid's grave. We've heard the story for over a century. Billy was shot by Pat Garrett in 1881 and buried the next day in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. A quick burial, no public viewing, and little documentation. You'd think someone that legendary would have a marked grave, a preserved site, something concrete. But instead, what we have is one of the most confusing burial stories in the Old West, involving floods, lost markers, stolen headstones, and even debates over whether a body is there at all. Let's start with the official version. After Pat Garrett shot Billy, allegedly, his body was buried at Old Fort Sumner Cemetery, just a short distance from where he was supposedly killed. His grave was placed between two of his closest friends, Charlie Beaudry and Tom O'Folliard, both fellow regulators who died during the Lincoln County War. But here's the twist. For decades, Billy's grave was unmarked. There was no stone, no plaque, nothing to distinguish it from the rest of the cemetery. Just a mound of dirt and local memory. In 1882, about a year later, someone placed a simple wooden marker at the site. But wooden markers don't last long in New Mexico's climate. And worse, the cemetery was hit by a massive flood in 1904. Water tore through Fort Sumner, washing away headstones, displacing remains, and leaving the burial sites in total disarray. Local accounts from the time described coffins unearthed and bodies drifting from their original plots. That's right. The very ground Billy the Kid was said to be buried and was literally swept away. Since then, no one's been able to say with absolute certainty where exactly his bones are, or they're still there at all. After the flood, a marble tombstone was finally erected in 1940, almost 60 years after Billy's death. It reads, Billy the Kid Pals, and includes the names of Beaudry and O'Folliard. But here's the catch. That stone was based on guesswork. Locals tried to remember the general area where Billy had been buried, but with no original marker and no clear records, it was all speculation. Then came the headstone thefts. Yes, plural. In 1950, the headstone was stolen. It disappeared for years before finally being found in Texas and returned. Then in 1981, it was stolen again. This time, law enforcement launched a full investigation. The thief eventually returned the stone after being caught in Florida. Since then, it's been bolted down and caged in iron bars, a fitting metaphor for how tightly the mystery of Billy's death is now locked in legend. But here's where the story turns from strange to surreal. In the 1990s, a movement began to settle the debate once and for all. Could we prove who's really buried in that grave? With modern DNA science, it should be possible. If we had a confirmed body, that's when Lincoln County officials, historians, and forensic experts pushed for an exhumation. Their goal was simple: dig up the grave, extract DNA, and compare it to samples from Billy's mother, Henry McCarty, whose remains were believed to be buried in Silver City, New Mexico. But it didn't go as planned. The state of New Mexico denied the request, citing legal concerns, historical preservation, and a lack of compelling justification. They claimed there was no criminal case, no living family requesting the test, and no official reason to disturb the grave. In short, they said no, and they've kept saying no ever since. But what if there's a more personal reason? Some believe that if the grave were open and it turned out Billy's body wasn't there, it would destroy a massive part of New Mexico's tourism industry. Fort Sumner draws thousands of visitors every year. The grave, the museum, the legend is an entire economy built around a possibly empty hole in the ground. Exhuming the grave risks unraveling the very myth that brings people in. So, maybe it's not just about preservation. Maybe it's also about preserving the legend. And don't forget, in Hamilton, Texas, there's another grave, the one belonging to Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid. Some have called for his body to be exhumed. 2, in order to run a comparative DNA analysis. The idea is simple. If you can't confirm Billy's grave in Fort Sumner, maybe you can prove Brushy Bill was him. But again, no state has approved the test. Too controversial. Too risky. Too political. Think about it. We can DNA test ancient mummies. We can identify Civil War soldiers. We can solve cold cases from the 1800s. But we still can't say for sure where Billy the Kid is buried. That should tell you something. That maybe, just maybe, someone doesn't want this mystery solved. So what does that mean for the legend? For history? For everything we've been told? It means Billy the Kid might still be out there, buried under a name not his own. Or maybe never buried at all. Maybe he lived out his days in Texas, as Brushy Bill claimed. Maybe Garrett lied. Or maybe the truth was lost in a flood, a missing report, and a century of silence. Coming up next, what does modern science say? Could DNA really prove anything at this point? Or is it too late? We'll look at the scientific roadblocks and the reasons this outlaw's final truth may stay buried forever